Today we're going to talk about a topic that you're probably familiar with if you've ever watched a Marvel Snap live stream or scrolled down to the comments underneath any YouTube video talking about a deck highlight, and that is replacing cards in a Marvel Snap deck that you are missing. In Marvel Snap, every player has a unique collection up until the point where you have most of the cards, and this makes finding decks to play on the internet quite challenging because while you can have a number of the cards in the deck, frequently you'll be missing some handful of them, and you'll need to figure out, can you still make that deck work, or are you missing a component that is key to making the archetype consistent and powerful? In today's video, I'm going to talk through some examples of how you can learn to identify cards that you can replace in Marvel Snap decks when you're looking at them. We're going to walk through some examples of how to do that with specific cards. And then we're going to talk about some generalities and how to identify groups of cards that are really quintessential or not replaceable inside of archetypes when you're looking at them. Let's go ahead and get right to it. The first thing that you have to do when it comes to identifying a card that you want to replace in a Marvel Snap deck is figure out what role that card serves in the deck list that you're looking at. Let's take popular and powerful Series 3 card Maximus as our first example here. Maximus is a 3 energy, 7 power card that has a detrimental on reveal effect of drawing your opponent 2 cards. In most of the decks Maximus is played in, it is played as a high stat, low energy card that is frequently played out on the final turn of the game when drawing your opponent 2 cards generally no longer matters because they're not going to have a follow-up turn to leverage those resources that you're giving them. When it comes to replacing a card, we generally want to find something that has a similar energy cost as well as a similar role that it can fill. If we look at other available 3 energy cards in Marvel Snap that have higher stat lines than a drawback, we actually get a perfect candidate that's a Series 1 card in Swordmaster. Swordmaster only 6 stats compared to Maximus' 7, and also has a detrimental on reveal effect that we can largely mitigate by playing out on the final turn of the game. In most cases, Swordmaster is going to end up being a strictly worse Maximus, but it also comes very close to doing the exact same thing as Maximus while providing marginally less stats. The second way to approach replacing cards in a Marvel Snap deck that you're missing is preferred, in my opinion, to finding things that are strict downgrades like Maximus into Swordmaster, and that's finding a card that fills a similar role but is just kind of different in a way where it's better in some spots or worse in others. Continuing our example with Maximus, Polaris is actually one of my favorite substitutions for Maximus. While Polaris has 2 less stats than Max, her on-reveal effect provides utility in key spots to get you out of sticky situations, and the fact that she doesn't have a detrimental on reveal actually gives her flexibility to be played on curve without penalizing yourself, unlike Maximus and Swordmaster. Polaris is a card that's just a little bit different than Max while also being similar in some spots and not being a strictly worse substitution overall. Let's go ahead and run through a couple more examples of how you can substitute out individually powerful cards in a deck list by thinking about what they do and what your replacement should be doing. Let's start with Magneto here. 6 energy, 12 power card. Powerful on reveal effect, move all opposing 3 and 4 cost cards to Magneto's location. So Magneto serves 2 purposes in the decks that are playing it. It is disruptive by grabbing your opponent's cards and pulling them around the board in a way that they probably won't be happy with, and 2, it provides a mess of stats. That means if you need to replace this Series 3 card in a deck that you're looking at, you want to kind of ask yourself, okay, is this card primarily here for its disruptive element, or is it primarily here for the mess of stats that it provides? If the answer is the former, you want it for the disruptive element primarily, Arrow, another Series 3 card, could be a reasonable placement for Magneto because her on reveal pulls your opponent's cards around the board in a way that's disruptive. It's disruptive in a slightly different manner, but it's still movement based and is still giving you control over how your opponent's cards are playing out. Let's say you're looking at Magneto in a deck like Lockjaw, however, and the most important thing about it there is its stat line. That means you could simply replace Magneto with another large card, such as starter card the Hulk, or another Series 3 card such as Giganto, that's just a mess of stats that you can be putting into play. For our final example of trying to replace an individually good card, we have Mysterio. 2 energy, 4 power card that creates kind of a shell game by playing out 0 power Mysterio clones across the board, leaving your opponent guessing where exactly your stats are being played out to. Again, we have a card that's primarily doing 2 different things. The first is it's going wide across the board, so it's filling up your spaces for things like Ant-Man or Mojo. It's also providing non-ability bodies for things like Patriot, or something that can hold the bonus from something like Nova when it gets destroyed. The second thing Mysterio is doing is it's just a pretty individually good statted 2-drop that's going to provide a reasonable amount of power on the second turn of the game. Now, again, we want to ask ourselves, what is Mysterio doing in the deck list that is being played in? If it's primarily being played in a deck list that is looking to go wide, Squirrel Girl is an excellent Series 1 card that can provide a similar effect in a slightly different way. If you are simply looking for a good statted 2-drop, we actually have a variety of Series 1 and Series 2 cards that can serve a similar role as Mysterio. We have Angela, who can even get as high as 6 power. We have Cloak, who provides the same 4 power Mysterio does, while also providing a little bit of a mind game effect, especially going into the final turns. And lastly, we have Lizard, who actually has more stats than Mysterio, but has a detrimental ongoing effect under certain circumstances. For the second part of this video, I want to talk about the concept of card packages or groups of cards that work together and how you need to be watching out for them when it comes to looking at Marvel Snap deck lists that you want to be replacing cards in. Going back to the first example that we looked at tonight of Maximus, let's say you pull up this Ronin Dino deck list that I've played a few times on stream and you go, okay, Jeff, I have 11 cards in this deck, but I'm missing Maximus. Maximus, the 3 energy, 7 power card that draws your opponent's 2 cards. Jeff said earlier, I can just replace this with Swordmaster or Polaris. Let's make that swap and play some games. But that doesn't work here in this deck list, and the context is key as to why. The 5-drop in this deck next to Devil Dinosaur is Ronin the Accuser. Ronin the Accuser has the ongoing effect. This gets +2 stats for every card contained in your opponent's hand. In this deck list, Maximus isn't just a 7 energy, 3 power card with the drawback that we get around by playing him on the final turn of the game. He's an enabler for Ronin. He makes one of our 5-drops that we are playing more powerful on the final turn of the game. This means if you're looking at a deck list like this and you need to replace Maximus, you also need to replace Ronin with something else as well, because Ronin is a card that will no longer be operating at anywhere close to the same power level if you don't have an avenue of putting extra cards into your opponent's hand at some point over the course of the game. That being said, this archetype's still competitive and reasonable without Maximus and Ronin in it. The Moon Girl Devil Dinosaur archetype comes in lots of different shapes and forms, including this one. You just need to be aware that if you're missing one of the key parts in this particular deck list, it also means the second in Ronin the Accuser is not going to work out for you, and you need to adjust accordingly. I'd like to wrap up with one more example today, and it's probably a question you've heard asked if you've watched any amount of Marvel Snap on Twitch recently. That is, can you replace Darkhawk in the Darkhawk deck that you are looking at in front of you? Darkhawk, for those not familiar, is a 4 energy, 1 base power card that is the ongoing effect of getting +2 for each card remaining in your opponent's deck currently. Darkhawk, similar to Ronin, who cares about cards in your opponent's hand, is a card that you typically build around to maximize its effect. At base level, your opponent's deck's only going to have 3 cards in it at the end of the game, and 4 energy for 7 stats is kind of mediocre in Marvel Snap. That is why almost every Darkhawk deck that you look at is playing the card Rock Slide to add 2 rocks to your opponent's deck, thus adding 4 more power to Darkhawk. It's often playing Korg, which adds a single rock and 2 power for Darkhawk, and generally you'll also see Black Widow in this group as well, a card that will deny your opponent a draw, ultimately netting your Darkhawk another 2 points of stats. Let's take note of the 3 non-Darkhawk cards I just listed in that package of cards: Korg, Black Widow, and Rock Slide. All 3 of these cards are ones that saw fringe amounts of play before Darkhawk existed, but the disruption that they provided was inconsistent or sporadic, and they really didn't see play in any top Marvel Snap decks. With Darkhawk being added to the picture, these cards that were close suddenly become good enough because in addition to the sporadic disruption they provide, they are also adding stats to a very powerful 4-drop, Darkhawk, that we're getting to play in our deck. Now, hopefully those of you who have been following along have some idea of where I'm going with this. The answer is yes, you can replace Darkhawk in this Zabu deck, but once you replace Darkhawk in this deck with another card that can provide some stats, something like Jessica Jones or Rescue or Crossbones or Drax, suddenly we have 3 other cards in our deck that, similar to before Darkhawk released, really just aren't quite good or competitive enough without the extra oomph that Darkhawk provides for them. Korg, Black Widow, Rockslide, these are probably not cards that you want to be playing because they just aren't quite strong enough if Darkhawk is not present in your deck list. At this point, you're probably thinking, well, Jeff, if cutting Darkhawk means I also probably want to cut Rockslide and Black Widow and Korg, that's a third of the cards in this deck list. I'm basically playing a different deck at that point. The answer is, yeah, you are. There are certain cards like Darkhawk that are the primary payoff for what you are doing and building a deck around. And if you don't have that primary payoff, the details of the deck list, in order for it to be anywhere close to optimal, will need to shift significantly. I know it's disappointing to hear that you need something like Darkhawk to supplement the other 11 cards in this deck if you have it, but the blunt, honest truth is, without Darkhawk here, the deck's just not going to operate at anywhere near the same power level because just like before Darkhawk existed, Korg, Black Widow, Rockslide, these are cards that are close, but often just aren't good enough on their own. Ultimately, for better and for the worst in some cases, Marvel Snap is a game that's incredibly bad to try and net deck in. And that's not to say that I think net decking in general is bad, so much as it is to say that if you're going on random Marvel Snap content and copying deck lists and randomly cutting cards like Darkhawk from them for substitutions, you are going to end up having a much more difficult time being successful and laddering up in Marvel Snap than if you are instead looking at the cards that you have available in your collection and building around the synergies that you do have available to you. Now, I know deck building as a topic is not the easiest thing in the world. I'm someone that's been doing it in card games like Marvel Snap for decades, and I still feel like even I have a lot to learn as the card games and formats inside of these card games like Snap change, with more cards always being added. That being said, it's also an incredibly rewarding experience, and if you can learn how to identify which groups of cards synergize with each other, you'll not only be a better deck builder on your own, but you'll also be better at taking deck lists that you found online and adapting them in a way that still allows them to be powerful and fun. If you're someone that's interested in leveling up your deck building game a little bit in Marvel Snap, I'm going to link a video in the description down below where I go through looking at viewer card pools and show how I would approach building decks with them by identifying synergies that they do have available to them in it. Finally, thanks for making it all the way through to the end of the video. I would love it if you'd let me know in the comments down below how you approach building decks in Marvel Snap. Do you find what I said here when it comes to identifying which cards to replace and how applicable? Did you learn something? If you did, consider tapping that like button to help this content reach more people. If you're new to the channel and you made it all the way to the end, consider subscribing. I post Marvel Snap tidbits like this, as well as deck highlights and other game news updates 7 days a week here, and I'd love to see you back again. Enjoy the rest of your day.